Chapter 27. The Duel. Snow fell softly on the buried pyre. The Earthsong soldiers had packed down over the pit had been visibly different from the rockier ground around it, but once Nagi finished laying his shroud of new snow over the ground, it would be indistinguishable from any other part of the mountain. Takaru approached the circle in measured swordsman steps, his left thumb resting on the guard of Kyojetsu, ready to flick the weapon out at the slightest hint of danger. Then his eyes fell on his opponent. You! Misaki stood slowly, her own left thumb resting on Siridenia's glass guard. As she had expected, Takaru hadn't kept her waiting long. The snow had barely started to gather in her hair and the folds of her clothing. She had borrowed a ceremonial women's hakama from one of the Fina nuns. While the loose garment was not intended for combat, it allowed for more movement than the restrictive obi and kimono she usually wore. Misaki. Takara didn't quite seem to have put the pieces together. What are you doing here? I have an appointment, she said calmly as his eyes flicked to the sword at her hip. I challenged another warrior to a duel. She placed her right hand on Siridenia's handle. Evidently, he accepts. Takaru's reaction was disappointing but predictable. This is ridiculous, Misaki. You will return to the house immediately. No. She was done sitting with her disappointment. Here, on the snow-covered grave of her son, someone was going to pay for it. We're going to duel. We will do no such thing, Takaru said firmly. A man doesn't fight his wife. You forfeit then, she demanded. That would be a first in Matsuda history, wouldn't it? I also believe it entitles me to your head if I want it. I can't forfeit if it's not a real duel, Takaru snapped. You have to be a warrior to issue a challenge, and you are not. Am I not? Would you like to tell that to the Ranganese who got past your lines? She thumped a heel against the ground beneath which her victims were buried. I believe I killed 8 before you arrived to protect me, and 1 more when you refused to protect Hyri. Or did you think they had all dropped dead of their own accord? It is not your place to take up arms, Takaru's voice rose, as did his Jia, crushing down on her. You are a woman. Your only job is to look after the children. And why is that again? Misaki asked, her voice full of venom. Oh yes. Because my husband, the greatest swordsman in Shirajima, is supposed to protect us all. Misaki. His voice had grown dangerous. You will not speak to me that way. You are my wife. I never wanted to be your wife. Misaki burst out and found her voice breaking into a scream. I never wanted any of this. Gods, it had been so long since she had screamed. The sound was so visceral, even Takaru took a step back. I didn't want any of this, but I birthed that boy, and nursed him, and loved him, all because my parents wanted me to marry a Matsuda. The only reason I am here is that you are a strong Theonite who is supposed to keep me and my children safe. That's what I gave up my life for. Safety. I will not hear any more. I left everything behind to marry you. I have been an obedient wife, I have borne you children, I have done everything that was asked of me, so why did this happen? Why is my son gone? Misaki finished, breathless, feeling like she could fall into 1,000 pieces, like she could eat the world. She was ready to fight. I had my orders, was all Takaru said. Like you had your orders when Colonel Song burned the bodies of our dead and then turned his back on us? Misaki snarled. A Matsuda obeys his superiors. When I left the front line, Takaru's voice seemed to falter. Nisama was clear, I don't care about Takashi, Misaki spat. He isn't here anymore. Neither is Colonel Song or your father. You're all out of people to hide behind. I married you, I had a son with you, and you left him on the front lines to die when you had a chance to save him. Takashi is not going to answer for his death. You are. She whipped Siridenia from her sheath and leveled the blade at her husband's chest. Draw, Matsuda Takaru. I will not hear any more of this woman. Takaru bellowed, as if sheer volume could silence her now. This is your last chance to obey. You lost your right to my obedience when you stopped being a man. Misaki cut him off. If you want me to go back to the house, you'll have to fight me. I've stood by too long while you disgraced yourself, but this is the last time you will be weak in front of me. One of us is going to rest here with our son. Drawl, Takara held her gaze. There was no indication that the storm seething in her had prompted so much as a ripple in him. For a moment, The only movement between them was the slow undulation of falling snow. "You shouldn't yell so much." His voice was suddenly quieter. "It's not ladylike." Indignation twisted in Misaki's throat, and she shifted into her stance, preparing to attack. Her anger was itching to burst into action, and she had given him ample warning. "Besides," he said in that same subdued voice, "you made your case better in the letter." "What?" Misaki's fingers squirmed in their grip on Saradenya's handle. Her body was heartbeats from surging out of her control, like the lurch that had sent her into Kazu's arms, the fury that had driven her toward Colonel Song's throat, and it took all the willpower she had to hold it back. Takaru still hadn't drawn Kaiojutsu or summoned his whispering blade. If she was going to follow through with the formalities of the duel she had called for, she couldn't attack him until he had a weapon in hand. "It is customary," Takaru said, "for the challenge to be reviewed before a duel commences." Misaki glared up at him, eyes narrowing. "Does this mean you accept my challenge?" she asked. "If so, I don't need anything reviewed." "I know what I said." After 15 years of holding still, she didn't feel like she could take another moment. She wanted to fight. Ignoring her, Takuro reached into the fold of his kimono and produced the anonymous letter of challenge Misaki had left on the door of the compound. Namisake, wasn't that just like him? He couldn't even fight without making sure the paperwork was all in order. Emotionless, he read aloud, "Matsuda Takaru, I am one of many who lost my family, my home, all that was precious to me, to your cowardice and poor judgment. In abandoning the front lines during the battle, you condemned other warriors to die, including your own brother and son." "I told you, you don't need to read it," she said, but Takaru kept going. "Since our village has been ravaged, you have not spoken to the government on our behalf. When the bodies of our dead were disrespected, you did not speak up. When the authorities refused us aid, you did not dispute their decision. When we needed you most, you disappeared up the mountain, leaving others to assume your responsibilities. At every turn, you have proven yourself incapable of standing up to authority when those beneath you depend on you to do so. It is my belief that a coward like this is unfit to lead our village in its time of need." There had been so much righteous anger in Misaki as she wrote. Takaru's deep, calm voice stripped the words of their emotion, sharpening them to their simple cruelty. "For these reasons, I challenge you to single combat at the 9th Wadi on the ground where the Numu village once stood. If you would prove yourself a man, do so in single combat." Takaru finished, still staring at the letter. Incapable of standing up to authority, he repeated, strangely pensive, rather than angry, "Is this in reference to Colonel Song or to my brother?" "Both," Misaki said, her sword still drawn. "I stand by what I said and what I wrote. Do you deny any of it?" Takaru did not answer. When he reached his hip, Misaki twitched, ready to defend herself, but instead of drawing Kaiojutsu, he slowly untied the white string holding it in place and slid the pearly sheath from his belt. Then, just as slowly, he knelt and placed the moon's spire off to the side. "So that's how it's going to be," Misaki thought, shifting her grip on Saradenya. "He's starting right off with the whispering blade." Legend said Sasayeva could cut through anything. It remained to be seen whether it could cut Zilla's and glass. Misaki was ready. She had thought through every maneuver she had ever seen Takaru employ. She had planned counters for all of them. She was ready, but she hadn't planned for what he did next. Having set his sword aside, Takaru rested his palms on the snow-covered ground and bowed. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "I admit to all of the accusations the challenger has leveled against me." "So?" He scooped his hair to the side, exposing the back of his neck. "I forfeit," he bowed lower, offering his bare neck to the blade, "and offer my life in atonement." Misaki felt like the world had come to a halt. She might have thought she was dreaming, but she never could have dreamed this. Even at her most delirious, she would never invent a Takaru who ceded a fight, who knelt before a woman, who asked to die. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" "I'm accepting the terms of your letter," Takaru said. "I'm forfeiting and surrendering my life." I didn't mean all those things in that letter," she stammered, backpedaling in her confusion. "I only wrote what I thought would bring you here." All you had to do to bring me here was issue the challenge, Takaru said. You must have known that. The pang of guilt was disorienting. Misaki swayed, utterly lost. How had this standoff she had planned so carefully slid out of her control in a matter of moments? She had thought Takaru might try to force her back to the house, prompting her to resist or walk away in disdain, prompting her to chase him. She had known that the chances of him accepting her challenge like that of an equal were slim, but if he did, she had been certain he would defend his manhood and put her in her place. All paths ended in a fight. That was how she had planned it, how it had to be, so what in all the realms was happening here? Why was he on his knees? Why? The question came out strained. What? Before I kill you, she said, I have to know why. If you understand all my accusations, if you agree, then why did this happen? Why didn't you stand up to Colonel Song? Or to your brother? You bastard, how could you let all of this happen? Takaru's voice was so quiet it barely broke the silence of the falling snow. I have no answer. Misaki's mouth opened in disbelief. Isn't this what you wanted? Asked a voice in her head. Didn't you want to bring him low? Didn't you want to kill him? It wasn't until she stood over her husband, staring at his exposed neck, that she realized that the answer was no. She didn't want his life. But what did she want then? Why was she here? I felt them die. Takaru spoke the words toward his knees, his face hidden. You what? Misaki's voice that had been a screaming storm only moments earlier was no more than a whisper. Sometimes. I am not a man, he said slowly. I am the mountain. And for a Dinma, Misaki wondered if he had gone insane, if they had both gone insane, but he kept speaking. It is a state I have been able to affect since I was a child. I retreat deep into the snow and rivers, and sink myself into the ocean below, and everything on this mountain becomes me, and I become the mountain. It looks like meditation, but it is more. It is becoming a different sort of being. A different sort of being? Misaki repeated. A bigger being, he said, so big that I, Matsuda Takaru, ceased to matter. The first time it happened to me, I was very young. On that day, the snow fell thick, as it does now. My father was beating me for something. He knocked me down in the snow in the courtyard. And with my palms to the ground, I realized that I could disperse myself into the snow, spreading all across the mountain, even to the sea below and deeper, deeper, until the pain diffused through my new being, like a drop of blood into a pool. Maybe the pain and shame were too much for a small boy to hold, but the mountain could bear it all, so I became the mountain. Misaki could only stare down at her husband in awe. She had never experienced anything like what Takaru was describing, nor could she fathom why he was telling her about it now. As the mountain, I am hyper-aware of some things. I can feel every molecule of water, from the rivers, to the snow, to the subtlest movements of the mist all around. In the midst of so much sensory input, any feeling in my human self, physical or emotional, becomes insignificant, and therefore bearable. You're telling me that when your feelings are inconvenient to you, you just get rid of them? I let the size of the mountain dull them to the point of insignificance. It was bizarre to be vindicated in her suspicion that Takaru was not quite human. All those times Misaki had looked into his face and felt as though she could find no emotion there, she had been right. But why was he telling her all this now? Other Matsudas have been known to achieve this state too, through intense meditation, but I can slide into it like a glove on a whim. It shook Misaki for a moment that she had even contemplated fighting a man whose power was as big as the mountain itself. The poison had consumed her, turning her completely foolhardy, like a small, rabid creature thinking it could take on an animal 40 times its size. Matsuda's past deemed this ability a gift from the gods, Takaru said, but I have used it to hide. Since I was a child, using it to escape my father's wrath, I have used it to hide. When it is too much to be a man, I am the mountain. I have done this my whole life, when there was a truth I didn't want to acknowledge, a decision I didn't want to face, a pain I didn't want to endure. It is easier to enter a state in which I am spared human emotions like regret, or shame, or love. Do you ever feel love? Misaki demanded. She didn't know if the question came from spite or genuine curiosity. It said too much that they felt like the same thing. Takaru did not answer her question. It was a moment before he spoke again, leading in with a deep, rather human breath. When Takashi and Ai-sama ordered me back to the village, I became the mountain. It was the only thing I could do, the only way I could obey. Misaki was silent. The simple admission that he had struggled to leave Mamoru should have come as a relief. Instead, it just lay a new pain atop the old. Her husband had been human the whole time. But I made a mistake, Takaru continued. I retreated into the mountain to spare myself the reality of leaving my brother and son without considering the fact that they were born of this mountain too. Their Jia was bound to the same snow and ice and moving water as mine. I didn't realize that, in that state, I would feel them die. Misaki felt her hands shake on Siridenia. I was on my way back to the village when my brother died, and his eyebrow twitched, as if his face was trying to find an expression for the pain, but had forgotten how. It was sharp, Misaki, just a pinprick on the mountain, but it hit like a blood needle. Such a tiny thing, and I was paralyzed. For so many years, Takaru's silence had infuriated her. Now he was speaking freely, and she would have given anything to have him stop. I wish I could explain it. My brother was my shelter in all things. His death left me shaken, flayed, like nerve and muscle exposed to the air. The words were too raw, too near. When you spent years in the company of Takashi, who wasn't much for fancy words, and Takaru, who wasn't much for words at all, it was easy to forget that the Matsudas had a tradition of poetry as old as their tradition of the sword. Takaru might only stumble his way through Imperial Kaijengwa, but his Shirajima dialect was vivid and concise, like the simple clarity of Hairi's eyes. Unbearable. I felt after that, as I imagine a skinned man must feel, but I was the mountain, and I couldn't move, not backward toward Mamoru nor forward toward you and the little children. I could not act on my brother's orders or my own impulses. And then Mamoru died, Misaki whispered. Her grip on Siridenia had gone slack. As tears clouded her eyes, she remembered staring through a similar fog in the dark of the bunker. The haze of her concussion, or perhaps the tides of her own stubborn denial, had drowned the memory, submerging it deep in the back of her mind, but it came bobbing back now, Takaru, resting his head against the bunker door as his shoulders shook. In the dark, the low sound had mixed with the weeping all around them and gone unnoticed. She hadn't reached for him or spoken his name, even when she knew she should. Why hadn't she reached for him? It's all right, she meant to say, I forgive you, but she couldn't. Even now, part of her was still too prideful, too cruel. Taking a deep breath, she tried again. I know that a Matsuda's job is to defend the empire, even at the expense of his sons. Snowflakes caught in her tears as they ran down her cheeks, making them slow with cold. I know who I married. Who did you marry, Susanoo Misaki? Snow had gathered in Takaru's hair in the stillness. Who did you marry? I was supposed to marry a man with the strength and sense to keep my children safe. Then I have failed you completely. You didn't. Misaki stumbled over her words, lost between her overgrown anger at Takaru and this new and foreign urge to defend him. You didn't know that was going to happen. You didn't know you would be immobilized. That's no excuse. It doesn't change the fact that I couldn't carry out my brother's orders when they mattered, nor challenge them when it was needed, so cut me down. Even though you're a woman, you issued a formal challenge, so your hands and conscience should be clean in the eyes of the gods. You can rid the family of my spiritual impurity. That part surprised Misaki. Your spiritual impurity? I harbor anger toward my brother and regret for not protecting my son. That weakness has kept them both from passing to the next world. Perhaps the gods will allow me to take their place in hell, knowing my bitterness has passed out of the living realm. You think Mamoru's ghost stays because of you? Misaki didn't understand. She was the one who had suffered for nights with terrible visions. She was the one who couldn't let go. I never prayed for him. Why not? How do you face a son, an honest, brave warrior, who was killed while you stood and did nothing? I have been unable to send his spirit off, so he has haunted us all this time, stealing your sleep and Nagasa's. Last night, he caused my Jia to rise out of my sleep and it nearly killed us both. That wasn't you, Misaki had started to say, but she trailed off. Now that she thought back to the previous night, she remembered waking up drenched in sweat and tears. That water on her skin would have been the first to turn to ice if her Jia had been active. The ice spikes protruding from the walls had been straight and clear, much more like Takeru's clean blades than her own imperfect creations. "You stabbed yourself," she exclaimed in horrified realization. There were accounts of Theonites subconsciously wounding themselves with their own untamed Nyama, but it was only supposed to happen to children, whose powers were not developed enough to be lethal. In an adult, it was treated as madness. "It was lucky that you screamed," he said. "The sound woke me before my Jia had a chance to hurt you." Misaki realized then that when he had shouted at her to get out, it hadn't been anger in his eyes, but panic. He had been worried for her safety. "With that in mind, you should be careful in this endeavor." Takeru lowered his head again, voice peaceful. "I doubt my death Jia will manifest as dramatically as my brother's, but it may still be extremely dangerous. Make sure you get clear as soon as you've severed my spinal column." How could he speak so calmly about his own death? Why was his heartbeat so steady? "You're doing it now, aren't you?" Misaki accused. "Retreating into the mountain, so you won't have to face this like a man." "I am not." "Then how are you so calm all of a sudden? You had emotions a moment ago, when you were talking about Mamoru. How can you ask your wife to kill you as if it means nothing at all?" "Because this does not upset me. I don't believe you. How could someone as powerful as Takeru just give up on his own life without resistance?" "I'm telling you the truth. I haven't tried to enter that state since." Since Colonel Song burned the bodies, Misaki spoke the realization aloud as it hit her. "You couldn't face it, so you ran away, to retreat into the mountain." "I tried," Takeru said. "The anger didn't go away." "Oh, Takeru-sama." Misaki breathed, voice high in a mixture of exasperation and grief. "The anger isn't going to go away." For a moment, she couldn't name the emotion welling up inside her. When she did identify it, an insane part of her wanted to laugh, because it was pity. For this ridiculous man on his knees in the snow, for this blind, self-centered woman who had been married to him for 15 years and never seen him for what he was. 15 years, and she had never once looked at Takeru as someone who might need her help. Or if she had shut it down. "It's not my place, not my responsibility, not my family." "Well," Takeru asked, his voice as placid as ever. "Are you going to do it?" "No." She lifted her head and felt something flare to life in her chest, a fresh determination. "You've always been good with people," Kazu had said. If she could pull others out of their despair, she could do the same for Takeru. As she had just learned, he was just as human as anyone else. "The anger is not going to go away," she repeated in a stronger voice, "but you are going to face it and tame it like a man." "What?" Takeru looked up at her, confused. "You're guilty of the same thing I am, trying to please and obey your elders." Misaki shook her head. "Maybe that was a mistake. Maybe not. It doesn't matter anymore. None of them are here to give us the answers anymore. We're all out of parents and grandparents and brothers. It's just us." She paused, unsure where she was going. Maybe setting aside her own regret wasn't enough. Maybe this was the last thing she needed do for Mamoru. "Find the words, Misaki." She took a painful breath. "When you left Mamoru to hold the line, you were just a second son, following orders, but you're more than that now. You're the head of the Matsuda house. But I was never supposed to be. It was peacetime. None of this was supposed to happen." "I know." Emotion choked Misaki, and she was overcome by a sudden urge to do something she had never remotely wanted to do before. She wanted to rush to Takeru. She wanted to hold him, and to have him hold her. In the same moment, she realized that that was not an option. They weren't children. They needed more than a protective pair of arms. They needed to be more. "Whether or not my failures are forgiven, I am not equipped to protect our village," Takeru said, his frustration palpable, painful. "A force of fighters I might be able to lead, but I don't know how to care for a group of widows and orphans with no homes, no resources, and no support from the Empire." "But you have to. You realize that, don't you?" Misaki said. "If you don't assume the role of village leader, the government will send someone else. We'll be at their mercy, and that will be your doing." That gave Takaru pause. Look, maybe you're not at fault for everything that's happened up until now. Maybe I can't hold you responsible for the decisions of your father and brother, but you are responsible for what happens next. As was she. She understood that now, and she wouldn't fail. Not again. Fighting the Ranganese is one thing, it is what I was born to do, but defying the Empire. Takara shook his head. That is beyond my ability. It's impossible. It is impossible for ice to cut through steel. It is impossible for a Jijaka to stop a tornado. You're a Matsuda. The impossible is a day at the dojo for you. But, in the letter you wrote, forget what I wrote. Stepping forward, Misaki tore the letter from Takaru's hand and ripped it apart. I rescind my challenge. You can't just here is my new challenge. She pointed her blade at him as the torn pieces of Kairi fluttered to her feet. You agree to be a man and make this up to me. You are going to do whatever you have to in order to protect this family and this village, with or without the support of the government. Misaki, Takaru started to rise, but she put Siridenya to his neck and he froze. No, she said coldly. You don't stand up until you are ready to accept my new challenge. Do you accept, Matsuda Takaru? I have already told you that I don't know how to protect Takayubi woman. Even in his self-doubt, Takaru somehow still managed to sound condescending. I can't, you can, Misaki cut him off angrily. What makes you so certain? Because this time, when we head up that path, we do it together. This time, you will have me. Do you accept my terms and my help? I accept, he said, but his face was blank. There was no fear, but no conviction either. It was not enough. Then prove it, Misaki said. His brow creased in confusion. What? I can't take your word that you will accept my help when you have done nothing but disregard my advice and my feelings since I married you, she said coldly. And I can't take your word that you will stand to defend Takayubi when you won't even stand to defend yourself. What do you want from me? In answer, Misaki put the flat of Siridenya to his cheek. Do you know what this is? She asked. His eyes flicked to the black blade pressed to his pale skin. Yamenka obsidian? It's Zilazin glass. Experience, science, and ancient Yamenka religion say no other weapon can put a scratch on it. When you get up, you're going to prove yourself equal to the challenge. Prove that you're ready to do the impossible. If you can't manage that, Nami, I hope I know what I'm doing. Then this village has no use for you, and neither do I. She slashed downward. Takaru moved so fast it might have been pure reflex. Misaki barely saw the whispering blade before the icy weapon rang against Siridenya, knocking it away from its target. The impact of ice against glass was so intense that Misaki had no idea how she kept her grip on her sword. Takaru was on his feet. As the snow rose around him, Misaki's Jia rose as well, not around her, but inside her. She was still in the dark halls of the Matsuda compound, fighting for her family. In her mind, she had never left. She couldn't, she now realized, until she faced this last and most dangerous opponent. The enemy that loomed before her now was not Matsuda Takaru himself, but the bitterness of silence that had built up between them over 15 years. She would fight it, kill it. And when she was done, she would have a husband. Her children would have a father. Takayubi would have a leader. Mamoru could rest. Their blades crashed together, and Misaki experienced a moment of satisfaction when she realized that Takaru had not held back, but struck with full, bone-breaking force. This was followed by a moment of utter surprise when she realized that her bones were not broken. She and little Siridenya had withstood a stroke of Takaru's whispering blade. Not only that, but as the Zilazin glass guard locked with Sasayeba's ice one, Misaki stepped forward and, with an inhuman burst of power, shoved Takaru back. He recovered smoothly, his feet quickly finding their stance again in the gathering snow, but he looked stunned. The feat of strength from such a diminutive Theonite should not have been possible. What are you? Takaru whispered. Something bigger than myself, she realized. I'm Matsuda Misaki, she said with pride and honesty she never attached to those words before. I'm your wife. And she attacked him. The speed of her youth seemed to surge into her limbs, but more than that. She was something more than Susanoo Misaki or Shirawo, the shadow. She was fighting for something greater than 1 life, or 5, or 10. Takaru's will to live, Mamoru's soul, her family's future, the survival of Takayubi itself, all hung on her blade edge. That was something the shadow, in all her blind love and ruthlessness, would never have understood. Like Kazu, Tusama, and the giant, Susanoo Raiden, had borne the weight of Anryo in battles past, she bore Takaru's attacks and forced him back. Takaru responded with his flawless form, leaving no openings, but he was on the defensive as Misaki drove forward. In all her years of training at Daybreak, Misaki had never had the skill to match a master swordsman in combat. But unencumbered by the tight kimono or the childish cowardice that had bound her for years, she had become a new creature, more fluid and boundless than a girl, but more solid than a shadow, a woman of lightning sinew and roaring blood. For once in her life, her body kept pace with her mind. The moment she visualized a swing, the blade was there. The moment she registered an opening, she was inside it. If she willed her stance to hold, it held. She was breathing hard, but it occurred to her that for the first time since the soul pull, the heaving breaths were not hurting her lungs. 3 times the whispering blade cracked, but Takaru was quick to reform it. Good. If he could withstand Sirudenya, if he could fight through this, then there was hope for Takayubi yet. Snow whirled faster around them as Misaki crashed into the whispering blade a 4th time, shattering it. The moment was jarring. With her blood serving as an extension of her will, Misaki didn't feel the impact in her muscles and joints. Instead, she felt it in her soul, and it felt unnatural. The whispering blade was not supposed to break. She may have extended her willpower throughout her own body, but that still was not good enough. She needed it to reach beyond herself. She needed it to reach him. "Show me better," she willed Takaru as she pressed forward. "Show me the impossible." He gave a calculated amount of ground, but instead of using the retreat to reform his sasayeba, he changed tactics, making a broad, sweeping motion with his open hands. Snow rose to the flow of his jia and a serpent reared from the ground before Misaki, not quite a Matsuda dragon. That technique required the power of 2 full-grown Matsudas. But the creature was far bigger than any ice snake Misaki had ever seen in individual Jajaka form. The serpent slung razor-scaled coils protectively about Takaru and then raised itself up to face Misaki, ice-shard eyes gleaming. It was taller than a house, its fanged jaws open wide enough to bite her in half. It was a good attempt at intimidation, but Matsuda Takaru needed to be more than outwardly intimidating. He needed to be invincible to the core. Misaki hoped the icy creature was as mighty as it looked, but there was only one way to find out. As the creature struck, she stood her ground. Ice met glass. In 2 lightning strikes of Shadow's daughter, Misaki shattered the serpent's head. Flipping Sirudenya into a single-handed reverse grip, she extended her open hand to the creature's headless neck and seized control of the water inside it. Even at her strongest, she could not fight Matsuda Takaru for control of the snake's spines and scales. Ice was his undisputed domain, but Takashi had been the one with the decisively fluid energy to power the inside of the Matsuda dragon, and Takashi was gone. With a roar, Misaki heaved her arm back. Her jia ripped the liquid interior from the serpent, as if pulling the spinal cord from a living snake. The formation collapsed like a skeleton with no spine. "Do better." Misaki exploded through the rain of scales. "Give me more." Takaru. Matsuda Takaru buckled. He had never lost control of the dragon's armor. Even when Takashi's water moved at blinding speeds or changed direction sharply, he had been able to move with it. Following had never been difficult for him. He had assumed that Misaki, like most fighters, would attack the dragon's invincible exterior, but she had gone for the unstable interior, for Takashi's absence. The emptiness shook the heart of him while the impact sent his armor scattering in all directions. Flayed and boneless, he faced the creature he had awakened, this woman of God's blood and fury. Her face was flushed, strands of hair flying free of her bun, as she swept her glass sword through what remained of the dragon. Then she came at him, black eyes gleaming as bright and sharp as the obsidian. So many years, he had avoided touching this porcelain doll he had been given for fear of breaking her. He hadn't wanted to see this beautiful, strange woman crumble the way his mother had. Somehow, he had broken her anyway, but she hadn't broken quietly like porcelain. She had broken like black glass and ice, jagged and more dangerous than ever. Takaru summoned enough willpower to pull some of the dragon's scales toward his hands to form his whispering blade. The reflexive cold and pressure of his jia produced a sword hard enough that it wouldn't break against Misaki's glass weapon, but it would never cut through the Zilizan glass. He knew that with damning certainty before their blades even met again. A true whispering blade required pure focus and resolve. The blades he was forming now might cut through flesh and bone. They might even cut through metal, but they were not perfect whispering blades. They were off by a few molecules. The black sword slammed into Takaru's guard and he stumbled back. He had never had any trouble focusing his jia before. His blade had been perfect since he was a teenager. It had been perfect when he fought the Ranganese, perfect when he faced Mamoru in the dojo that day and called him weak. The irony was that Mamoru had been right about the Empire, about the Kwangs, about the Ranganese, and Takaru had called him weak. In the uncertainty of youth, Mamoru had been closer to true clarity than his father ever had been. Takaru had demanded that Mamoru stand and fight for his truth. Now that his wife was asking him to stand, all he could do was shatter and shatter and shatter. Misaki didn't slow, didn't give a coin of ground. Something had taken place inside the woman's body, some deep Susanoo blood magic that Takaru didn't understand, lending her inhuman strength. But strength alone couldn't move a fighter with such grace. As the tiny woman matched his steps, Takaru was forced to realize that he had spent 15 years sleeping obliviously next to a combatant very nearly his equal in skill. How had he never noticed? Or had he noticed and turned a blind eye to it, as he turned a blind eye to everything that unsettled him? So much of his life had been lost in the haze of snow, mist, and meditation that he didn't even know. Sasayeba cracked against a brutal blow of Misaki's sword. Instead of taking a moment to recover from the impact, she sped up with fresh fury, spinning into a stab. Takaru blocked and his ice broke apart, barely deflecting the obsidian sword before it could drive into his chest. She wouldn't really kill him, would she? He had never truly grown to know the woman who lived inside the doll, and it was hard to fight an enemy one didn't know. He attempted an offensive cut with a new Sasayeba, only to have it break against his wife's more decisive counterstrike. Matsuda Takaru I had found his whispering blade in perfect clarity. He had studied every corner of his world, from the Koro's castle to the Numu's forge, from the old religion to the new, and understood it all intimately. Unlike his ancestor, Takaru had only ever found the focus to form a whispering blade by retreating into the obscuring white of the mountain, where he was blind to his country, his wife, even his own emotions. What sort of a man closed his eyes to the world and called it clarity? All Takaru could see of this woman was that she was angry, and each time something cracked or shattered, she seemed to grow angrier, her movements more erratic, more ferocious, harder to read. There was pain in her fighting, coursing alongside the strength, pitching and rising like storm waves with each stroke of her sword. She was in agony, and it was his fault. He had never meant to do this to her, but with each defensive step back, he only seemed to make it worse, and he couldn't bear it. In her growl, he heard his father's bitterness, his mother's tears. Mamoru boiled from her eyes. He had to make it stop. He searched for an opening to grab hold of her, but she was too fast and showed no signs of tiring. If he pressed in with his imperfect Sasayeba, her obsidian blade would take his arm off. Shifting tactics, Takaru used his physical body as a focal point for her attacks while raising the snow around her in a trap. At the touch of his Nyama, the frenzied snow rushed to answer its master. Despite the physical strength Misaki had manifested, her sense of the water around her was still dull compared to a born Matsuda's. In the spinning confusion of snow, she didn't notice the water molecules massing behind her. Letting his blade shatter against hers, Takaru opened both hands and pulled the water toward them in a broad wave. Misaki screamed in surprise as the wave engulfed her from the shoulders down. She reacted with the speed of a trained fighter, dropping her sword to use both hands in an attempt to throw the water from her body. But Takaru was already freezing the liquid and her Jia was nothing against his. The wave froze solid, immobilizing her. "Yield," Takaru said, covering his fatigue under a commanding tone. Her glare pierced him, not like a blade, but like claws that dug in and held tight, making it impossible to pull free. "That was underhanded, Matsuda Takaru," she hissed as they locked eyes, equally immobilized. "I would be impressed if it weren't such an obvious sign of weakness." "I didn't take you for a cheater." "You never specified terms of combat," Takaru said. It was a pitiful excuse. Few terms of combat allowed techniques that restrained the opponent. Then again, Jajaka terms of combat had never been intended for duels between spouses. "I don't want to hurt you." "Hurt me?" Misaki's breath, cold as it was, made steam in Takaru's sub-zero aura. She looked, if possible, more agonized than she had in the flurry of combat. "This." Her eyes flicked down to the ice encasing her body. "This is how you try to ease my pain." Takaru had the feeling he was missing something. "I can't bring Mamoru back," he said. "But you can be better." She glared at him again, and merciful Nami, wouldn't those claws loosen their grip? "You can be better than the man who couldn't save him." "I will," Takaru promised. "I'm not going to hurt you again. If you don't want to hurt me, you will face me like a real fighter." Misaki's teeth ground together in a snarl, with respect. Takaru was used to other Theonites' Nyama falling still once they were encased in his ice. Unable to move their limbs, most had trouble using their powers to affect the world around them. But Misaki's power was not around her, it was inside, lending her little body godlike strength as it strained against its prison. Her pain screeched against him like claws on stone, and he struggled not to cringe. "This fight is over, woman," he insisted as though speaking the words aloud could make them true. "You have no weapon. Yield." "I won't. I can't." "You haven't accepted my challenge yet." "I have, you haven't fought me like a Matsuda." Her body heaved against the ice and cracked it. The break sent a jolt through Takaru's soul. He was a little boy, curled up on his side, shaking with the aftershocks of his father's fists, unable to understand where his mother had gone, why she had left, why his father hated him so much. Tusama had stomped on him twice, leaving a heel-sized bruise on his cheek and a lance of pain in his ribs. Knowing he would not be able to stand, he rolled onto his side and crawled. He was distantly aware that his brother must have stepped in to protect him, which meant that Takashi was probably hurt worse than he was. It wasn't a comforting thought. Guilt wound itself in with the confusion and broken blood vessels, creating a new, worse kind of pain. He knew that if he lay still and listened, he would hear Takashi crying, feel his brother's pain answering his own like an echo. So instead of listening, Takaru crawled faster, fingernails scratching across the tatami in desperation. Hand over hand, he dragged himself forward until he reached the deck overlooking the snow-covered courtyard. Hauling himself to the edge, he rolled over it, into the white embrace below. He landed hard on his side, probably adding to the bruises, but everything was all right now. The moment he hit the ground, the snow rushed to cradle him like his mother's arms, and he was safe. Spreading his fingers out in the whiteness, Takaru let everything flow to the mountain. The pain dispersed into 1,000 snowflakes, then 10,000, thinning like mist to the morning. For his whole life, Takaru had been certain that he was right to cast his pain off on the mountain, that it was the only way, because how could one possibly hold so much suffering in something as small as a human form? Yet here was this woman who held everything inside a little body of flesh and blood without breaking. It was as though all that pain had compressed in her slight figure like the molecules of a whispering blade or thousandfold steel beaten to a blade in the forge. She had taken every drop of hardship like a stroke of the hammer, turning it to strength, and she was stronger than Takaru. She was breaking him. "Stop," he commanded, but she continued to struggle. The splitting ice screamed with Takashi's voice, with Mamoru's, everything he had tried so hard to push away. He held his open hand ineffectually before him. "Stop," he bellowed, his voice no longer commanding. Begging. "Stop." Stop. One of Misaki's hands burst free. The ice had left scratches on her arms, red over the white scars from her fight with the Fanyukalu. Crashing out of her restraints, she raced forward. She had no weapon, but she came at him anyway. In that moment of awe, Takaru realized how much he owed this woman, who had borne his children, who had fought and fought and fought for a family she had never asked for. She had given him her life and demanded nothing in return. Mamoru hadn't inherited his strength from his father. It had come from her. Perhaps she was stronger than he was. Perhaps it was impossible for him to overcome this woman who seemed to carry the force of an army inside her. But she was right. A Matsuda didn't balk before the impossible. Takaru extended his jia to form a blade, but Misaki was ahead of him. She tore the sheath from her hip and slammed it into Takaru's face. The sheath must have been made of the same Zilizan glass as her blade, because it hit harder than any ice or metal Takaru had ever encountered. As he reeled, she threw a kick into his stomach. It had been decades since someone had struck him hard enough to knock him down, but in Misaki's monstrously powerful state, her foot slammed the breath from his body and sent him tumbling through the snow. When he uncurled onto his hands and knees, Misaki stood before him, breathing hard, her hair flying freely in the wind. She had retrieved her sword, though the sheath was still clutched in her left hand like a second blade. Through the knives of pain in his ribs, Takaru recognized a stance similar to Takashi's and wondered where she had learned to dual wield. Where had she found so much strength? No one had hit him this hard since his father. The snow pulled at Takaru, offering tenderly to take the pain away. His fingers spread out in its beckoning cold, ready to oblige, but Misaki was still looking at him with expectation in her eyes. That gaze clutched him like claws or a pair of arms holding him. So, instead of giving himself to the snow, Takara dug his hands into it hard. His fist tightened and the snow rushed up to him. In an agonizing surge, it seemed to give back everything he had sent out into it over 40 years. His brother's bruises, his mother's screams of impotent anger, his 19-year-old bride, holding her face in her hands as she fought to stifle her sobs, his father holding a bamboo rod and cracking it down on him. The stick hit his ear and became the crash of bombs on Takayubi's slopes. It hit his back and became Kotetsu Atsushi's fists as he begged Takaru to go back for his father, please. Matsuda Dano. Please. It hit his arm and became Misaki's blood needle. It hit his knuckles, and he felt them crash into Mamoru's teeth, bloodying the boy's mouth. Hold the line, he had said as his son looked at him in fear. And Mamoru had. He had protected Takayubi with everything he had. Now it was Takaru's turn. Clutching the truth of his life in his hands, he stood. Misaki was rushing toward him now, the final, most important part of his life bearing down on him. And he saw them both for what they were, a woman who needed her husband and a man who needed his wife. That clarity sharpened to an edge. The whispering blade met Misaki's obsidian sheath and sheared through it. Her eyes went wide, and she smiled gods in the deep. She smiled a raw, open smile, and it was the most beautiful thing in all the Duna. Her sword hit the broadside of Takaru's whispering blade, knocking it off course, but this time, the ice didn't shatter. It didn't even crack. Discarding the sliced-off half of her sheath, Misaki attacked Takaru with new energy. For the first time, they met each other, not a frozen mountain and a doll, but living flesh, a man and a woman. Misaki's smile grew. She had what she needed from him. But in his new clarity, Takaru realized that there was one more thing he needed from her as a man. She spun in to cut at his neck, and he lowered his arm. Misaki. Misaki threw her entire body into the attack, knowing the whispering blade would be there to meet her, ready to smash through it or break in the effort. The impact didn't come. Panic jolted through her fighter's high. Even in her state of heightened reflexes, she barely managed to jerk to a stop before her blade sheared Takaru's head from his shoulders. The black glass bit into his neck, and the world spun to a halt, the snow itself seeming to pause in shock. Misaki stood there, breathless, heart-hammering, as 2 drops of blood beaded on Takaru's neck. 2 drops. She hadn't killed him. But it had been a close thing. Why? She thought furiously. Why didn't he block? He should have had time to counter, so why hadn't he? Had he been trying to trick her into killing him? Had he been testing her? But when she looked into her husband's face, his expression wasn't smug or knowing. It was openly surprised. Then, as she watched, that surprise melted into something softer than triumph. Relief. They looked at each other, chests heaving with exertion, Cyrodinia still resting at his neck. Then the whispering blade turned to snow, fluttering down to rest at their feet. Takeru's fingers touched her sword hand. I accept, he said, and for once, his voice was full, overflowing with gratitude and strength and the determined bite of winter. And Misaki somehow understood why he had given her that last opening. If she truly wanted to kill him, then he was alone. He was willing to stand and fight, but he would rather die than do it alone. It wasn't just the challenge of responsibility he was accepting as his hand touched hers. He was accepting her. Cool fingers ran over Misaki's sword hand, over her sleeve to brush the hair back from her face. In the falling snow, Takeru stared at the woman he had married and saw her for the first time. I accept. Chapter 28. The Stranger. Takayubi legend said that a Matsuda had never walked away from a duel without first spilling his opponent's blood on the ground. Takeru and Misaki broke that tradition that day. She caught the drops of blood before they could fall and placed a gentle hand over the cut on his neck. He didn't push the hand away, even as her Jia tugged at his open wound, knitting the liquid into a scab. You're stronger than I thought, Takeru said. Misaki made a dismissive noise in her throat. It was a fluke. I've been in far better shape. I wasn't talking about your sword play. I always knew about that. Misaki blinked in surprise, snow fluttering from her eyelashes. You did. Then she sighed. I suppose I underestimated your powers of perception. No. Your father mentioned it when he first described you to us. You never said anything. Misaki paused. Why didn't you say anything? I don't know. That thoughtful crease appeared between Takeru's eyebrows. I'm sorry, I never asked. I never offered. Instead, she had boarded her real self up behind a stiff facade, hoping that somehow she could turn herself into something else. I'm sorry. Misaki rubbed her open palm over Takeru's neck one last time before letting it trail down to rest against his chest. The cut had scabbed over, stopping the bleeding. Thank you, Takeru said, for offering now. He lifted his hand to touch the cut on his neck, not the one Misaki had just scabbed over, but the one Mamoru's ghost had left during that last nightmare. I think I should stay a while, he said, and say goodbye to my brother and son. Misaki nodded. Of course. But she found that the thought of leaving Takeru alone on the mountainside upset her. He had spent too long alone in the snow, hadn't he? Meditating the humanity out of himself, sinking deeper into a refuge that was now stained with his family's blood. Would it be all right if I stayed with you, Takeru-sama? She asked softly. Takeru was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. Please. The sky was darkening by the time the two stood to make their way back home. Misaki had frozen the two pieces of Cyrodiania's sheath together to hold the blade. It was cold enough that the ice would stay strong, but eventually, she would need a new sheath. I asked Setsuko to watch the boys while we were gone, Misaki said. I told her I might be a while, but I hope she hasn't gotten worried. I think she has, Takeru said. She seems to have sent someone to find us. What? Someone is coming down the mountain toward us. Takeru cocked his head as though listening. 2 people. We should go to meet them, Misaki said, brushing the snow from her knees. Let them know we haven't vanished. It was bizarre how she still didn't feel any physical pain, even after fighting and then sitting with her legs folded beneath her for so long. They had barely started up the southern pass when Misaki's eyes landed on a figure carefully shuffling down the mountain toward them. Kwang Chulhi had gotten better at keeping his footing on Takayubi's slopes, but he still made his way around more slowly than the native villagers. Oh, the boy said when he caught sight of Misaki and Takeru through the falling snow. It's you. Kwang, Takeru said, effortlessly covering the distance to the stumbling boy with his smooth stride. What are you doing here? Setsuko-sama said you had both been gone a long time and she was getting worried. She asked if I would go looking for you. We are well and on our way back, as you can see, Takaru said, though Misaki noticed Chulhi's eyes brush uneasily over the fresh cuts on Takaru's neck. All right. Chulhi stopped short. His eyes had fallen on the sword at Misaki's hip. What is that? That is my wife's business, Takaru said a little sharply. As a lady of a noble house, she can bear a sword if she know I've seen women with swords before, Chulhi clarified, just not swords like that. Matsuda Misaki Dano-sama. He fumbled his Shirajima honorifics in his excitement. Is that what I think it is? Misaki glanced down at Suradenya. You have a good eye. You mean, that's Zillison glass? Misaki said. Yes. You're joking. Chulhi exclaimed, slipping into his native Kaijengwa in his disbelief. Kotetsu said there were no Zillison katana. Do you want to see for yourself? She suggested in Kaijengwa. Chulhi looked breathless. Could I? With a smile, Misaki untied Suradenya and handed the sheathed weapon to Chulhi. He bowed, accepting it with both hands. Careful, she warned as he gripped the handle and slid it partway out of the sheath. It's sharper than most swords, but it doesn't rust, so you can touch the flat without worrying about leaving finger oils. Oh, Chulhi said as he turned the blade over. And the sheath must be Zillison glass too. Misaki hesitated, but realized that would be hard to lie to the boy while he was holding the sheath in his hands. Yes, on the inside. So, what happened to it? Chulhi asked, resting his fingertips on the ice Misaki had used to repair the sheath. He might not be a Takayubi warrior, but he was still a competent Jujaka. He could almost certainly feel that the sheath had been severed. She glanced at Takaru. Unfortunately, it got damaged, she said. Chulhi's fingers were still resting over the ice on the sheath, his brow creased in confusion. It feels like it was cut in two. Isn't that interesting? Misaki smiled, taking the sword from him and sliding it back into the belt of her hakama. But it's cut, Chulhi said in confusion. Nothing can cut Zillison. He trailed off, looking up at Takaru. His eyes flicked again to the cuts on Takaru's neck, then to Misaki's disheveled hair and clothing, and back to Takaru. His mouth worked soundlessly for a moment, but all the questions on his tongue were undoubtedly inappropriate to voice. We should get back to the village. Takaru motioned Chulhi and Misaki after him, and they continued up the mountain. Let's find the other one and head back. Other one, Chulhi repeated. There were two of you who came down the mountain to look for us, were there not? Chulhi shook his head. I came alone. No. Takaru stopped in his tracks, suddenly wary. There was someone behind you. Are you sure, Takaru-sama? Misaki asked. Sometimes an exhaustive use of Jia like a fight affected a Theonite's senses. Maybe? Her words trailed off as movement caught her attention on the path ahead. A figure stood blocking their way, Matsuda blue kimono blowing gently in the wind, a teal-wrapped sword at his hip. Mamoru. Misaki screamed, her hands flying to her mouth. Terrified that something had made her start hallucinating, she looked to Takaru and Chulhi, but they were also frozen where they stood, disbelieving eyes fixed on the apparition. How? Chulhi stuttered, shaking. Why is he here? Mamoru drew his katana, and that was the giveaway. Just for a moment, brightness flickered across him, like dappled light across a forest floor. Misaki had seen bright ripples like that before and knew exactly what they meant. That was not Mamoru, nor was it his ghost. As the imitation Mamoru came at them, Takaru took an uncertain step back, an arm out to shield the other two. But Misaki stepped forward, gathering her Jia into an ice spear. Even knowing it wasn't really him, she couldn't shoot ice directly into her son's heart. She couldn't kill his image. Chulhi let out a cry of alarm as she fired her projectile. The ice struck the pretender in the shoulder, knocking him backward and shattering the illusion. Freckles scattered across Mamoru's cheeks, black hair turned brown, and the blue kimono turned into a flapping gray cloak. The katana spun out of his hand and hit the snow as a long Heidian-style knife. Even in his shock, Takaru reacted prudently, raising ice to freeze the stranger's arms and legs in place where he lay. What is that thing? He demanded, more shaken than Misaki had ever seen him. He would be, having never met Eileen Eldon. Some kind of demon? That's no demon. Misaki was striding toward the fallen creature. It's a litigii. A what? A type of subtheonite, Misaki explained as she came to stand over the man. They look like powerless Adens, but they have the ability to manipulate light to create illusions. I knew a few in Karyatha. But what the hell was one of them doing here? The man glared silently up at Misaki, but they both knew there was nothing he could do against her now. Litigii like himself were dangerous only in what they could make a person see. He would not have the physical strength to break himself out of Takeru's ice. An intense flash of light might leave Misaki temporarily blind, but she fought better without the use of her eyes anyway. Secure in her safety, Misaki took a moment to survey the man. He appeared to be in his 20s or 30s. She had always found it difficult to place white people's ages, with dull green eyes and brown hair cut in a short Hadean style. The lines of a tattoo made a strange, swirling pattern through his smattering of brown freckles. She searched her memory for someone like this man, but she couldn't recall ever encountering a green-eyed litigii, let alone one with such strange tattoos. Even the tattoo ink was unlike anything Misaki had ever seen, shiny and metallic. With a sweep of her hand, Misaki cleared the snow that had fallen on his face, just to be sure she wasn't imagining the silvery glint. He had something in his skin. It looked like metal threaded through his tattoos, but when Misaki reached out with her Jia, the shining substance felt almost like liquid. "You're very skilled," she said. That replication of Mamoru had been on par with one of Aline's illusions. Nearly perfect. "Who are you?" Takeru, who had most likely never seen a white person, approached more cautiously, Chulhi trailing just behind him. "It's all right, Takeru-sama," Misaki said. "He's just a human, like you or me, only weaker. Watch." Putting a tabi to the man's arm, she applied a bit of pressure and the bone snapped. The white man's body went rigid and his face contorted, but he didn't cry out. The only noise he made was a valiantly smothered grunt. Misaki raised her eyebrows. That sort of ironclad composure spoke of intense training, though she could feel his heart pounding rapidly in distress. "All right, I don't know how good your Shirajima dialect is, so let's try Yamanink," Misaki said. "Who are you and who sent you here?" Normally, she wouldn't have taken any pleasure in torturing someone weaker than herself, even one who had tried to kill her. But this man had stolen her son's face. She would happily break every bone in his body. "Don't speak Yamanink, you piece of zero?" "That's fine." She switched languages again. "I speak Lindish too. Now, talk to me. Who are you? Did you come here from Karyatha?" Robin had always worried about his old enemies pursuing him, but Misaki had never personally made many enemies in Livingston. Sure, she had sliced quite a few people, but that had mostly been as backup to Robin and Aline. Most people thought of Firebird and didn't recall his shadow. The hooded gray cloak immediately brought to mind Kaliso and his followers, but for all Kaliso's bizarre and horrific gimmicks, Misaki had never known the gang lord to give his followers facial tattoos. Maybe that was a new practice? Or maybe the markings were some sort of native Hadean adornment that had nothing to do with the man's other affiliations. Is this about Livingston? She ground her foot down, extracting another pained grunt from the supine litigii. Had a run-in with Zero 15 or 16 years ago. You don't look like you're missing any appendages, though I'm happy to fix that for you. Do you recognize him? Takeru asked, unable to understand Misaki's Lindish. "No, Takeru-sama." "Do you?" Takeru shook his head and then turned to Chulhi. "Kwang. Don't look at me, Matsuda Dano," Chulhi stammered. "I've never even met a litigii before." "Well, this one must have been here for some time, spying." Misaki narrowed her eyes at the restrained intruder. "What do you mean?" "Litigii aren't magic. They have photographic memories, but they can't just pull faces out of the ether. They can only reproduce what they have observed, which means..." "This man watched Mamoru when he was alive," Takeru said in quiet horror weeks ago. "Why? That's what he's going to tell us." Misaki looked down at the foreigner and switched back to Yamanink, the language an international spy was most likely to understand. "Isn't that right, litigii? You're going to tell us everything we want to know while you still have 4 limbs and a tongue." "Oh," Chulhi said warily. And Matsuda, I'm pretty sure that's against the international codes of good thing those only apply to military operatives, Misaki said. I'm a civilian. But quiet, Kwang, Takaru ordered shortly. So? Misaki prompted, glaring down at the litigii. Do you want to talk or do you want me to cut you? Light flickered. The man's hair turned black and for a moment, Mamoru's face overlaid his, a pleading expression in his eyes. Agony lanced through Misaki and she stomped down hard. Her heel broke through the man's femur and his cruel illusion in a single crunch. This time he did scream. No, she said sweetly as Chulhi cringed. You don't want to waste your concentration on manipulative illusions right now. No, you're going to want to concentrate very hard on telling me what I want to know before this gets really unpleasant. The man set his jaw, agonized breaths coming fast through clenched teeth. His heart was racing, but he didn't answer. Now, don't be like that. Misaki drew Saradenya and Chulhi covered his eyes. If you won't talk to me, you can't tell me which body parts you'd rather part with first. I'll just have to guess. The man did speak then, in the most bizarrely accented Yamanink Misaki had ever heard. Voice activation. Misaki's heart dropped. Get back, she cried. Detonate. The reflexive ice wall Misaki formed between herself and the litigii never would have held against the blast, nor would her legs have propelled her far enough to escape. But Takaru's Jia surged up alongside hers, tripling the size of the wall, and an arm around her waist swept her back. They crashed to the snow together as the explosion shook the mountain. When the ringing in Misaki's ears faded enough that she could think straight, she lifted herself up onto her elbows and shook her head. Her back bumped into something colder than the snow beneath her, and she realized that she was under Takaru's arm. He had braced his body just above hers to protect her from the falling debris. Are you all right? She asked, her voice sounding warped and distant. Takaru responded with something that sounded affirmative. Under his other arm, Chulhi was groaning, his hands over his head. Worried that the boy was injured, Misaki reached out with her Jia to see if she could sense any bleeding. He's fine, Takaru said in exasperation, just as Chulhi's groans solidified into words so loud. Leaving Chulhi curled up on the ground, Takaru stood and helped Misaki to her feet. What in all the realms was that? Misaki asked, turning back to where the litigii had lain in the snow. I was hoping you might tell me. Nothing remained of the man except a crater and a few shreds of flesh and gray fabric flung across the mountainside. Misaki shook her head. I've never encountered anyone like him. Other litigiwo, yes. Other people in gray cloaks, yes, but never anyone with tattoos or an accent like his. She went to retrieve Saradenya where it had stuck in the snow after flying from her hand. Were you really going to cut him? Takaru asked, pulling a shaking Chulhi to his feet. Only if he kept being uncooperative, Misaki said, and carefully returned her sword to its sheath. There was a pause. You enjoyed that. It wasn't a judgment. Takaru just seemed to be making an observation. Misaki shrugged. This is the sort of thing I used to do with my friends back in Livingston. At school. Takaru looked confused. Well, after school, Misaki said, at night. We didn't get much sleep. Matsuda, a voice called, and Misaki and Takaru looked up to find Kazu's men and some of the amino corona running down the slope toward them. We heard a sound like a bomb. What happened? There has been an attempt on our lives, Takaru said as the men came to a stop at the sight of the explosion. My wife's and my own. What? Calmly, Takaru told the men what had happened, which of course sounded ridiculous. So, you think it was an assassin? One of the amino coronu asked. It was definitely an assassin, Misaki said. A litigii didn't put himself up against two powerful Theonites unless he had a plan to end the fight quickly. This one had most likely hoped that his illusion of Mamoru would immobilize his targets for the moment he needed to kill them with that knife of his, which might have allowed him to escape with his life. The bomb had been his backup plan. Who do you think sent him? One of Kazu's men asked. The Ranganese, or... He couldn't say it aloud, but everyone was thinking it. The Empire. This man was not from Namindagu, Takaru said. He was white. There are white people who live in Namindagu, in the Ranganese Union, Chulhi pointed out. It was something most Dunians didn't even know. Really? Hakuyu said in surprise. They live far in the west, Misaki said, near the border with Hades. They have their origins in a Hadean tribe called the Malakovish, but politically, they count as part of the Ranganese Union. I've never heard of any Litigiwu among them, but it's possible. Then again, it was equally possible for an organization to hire a foreign assassin to throw someone off their trail. But if the man had been sent by the Ranganese, who is with my family? Takuro voiced the question that had just leaped to the forefront of Misaki's mind. Your sister-in-law is with the children, the head amino said. I have a few of my men helping work on the house. They should be safe. Misaki was already running up the slope. Stay on the alert, Takuro told the men. Report back to the village as soon as you've investigated to your satisfaction. And he was running alongside her. Everything seemed normal when they reached the village, and they shared a breath of relief to find Setsuko and all the children safe in the Matsuda courtyard. Setsuko stood and rushed to meet them immediately. Is everything all right? She asked urgently. We heard a sound like an explosion and Takuru, Matsuda-sama, you're injured. We're fine, Takuru said. Amino-san, he addressed one of the men working on the house, a volunteer named Amino Kentaro. Run to the rest of the houses. Tell everyone to check that every person in their household is safe and accounted for. Have each volunteer leader do the same with his group. If anyone has spotted a suspicious person, have them report here immediately. What? There will be time to ask questions later. Takuro cut him off. Go. Yes, Matsuda Dano. The man set down the beam he had been lifting and ran. What is going on? Setsuko asked as Misaki took Izumo from her sister-in-law and bounced him gently on her hip. There was an attempt on our lives, Takuru said as Hiroshi and Nagisa gathered near the adults to listen curiously. Neither of us is seriously hurt, but we need to confirm that no one else in the village has been targeted. What? Who tried to kill you? Setsuko asked. The details are unimportant for the time being, Takuru said. For now, I'm just relieved that my family is safe. Misaki would have expected Setsuko to ask more questions, but the other woman had stopped, staring at Takuru. Evidently, she had noticed the change in him, the way his voice carried a modicum of emotion. Her expression of confusion turned to one of shock when Takuru stooped and picked up Nagisa. To Misaki's memory, Takuru had never held one of his children. Nagisa himself looked disoriented at suddenly finding himself so far from the ground. I've just been to see your brother, Nagasa-kun, Takuru said. Mamoru. Nagisa said in a small voice. Yes. Nagisa still looked profoundly confused. Tusama, see Mamoru? I did. Where is he? Nagisa asked, his hands clutching his father's shoulder. Where is Mamoru? He's in Alexara now, Takuru said. He promised that he wouldn't come to bother you anymore. He wants his little brother to be able to sleep. I can sleep. It wasn't clear if Nagisa completely grasped his father's meaning, but the words seemed to calm him. You can sleep, Takuru said and placed Nagisa back on his feet. He also wanted me to remind you another thing. He took Nagasa's little chin between his thumb and forefinger. A warrior doesn't cry. Nagisa nodded. Mamoru doesn't want you to cry. Takuru rested a hand on Nagasa's head, ruffling the boy's hair before turning to his second son. Hiroshi. Yes, Tusama? Takuru studied his second-born for a moment, the little boy who stood with enough tension in his shoulders to break an adult. He didn't take Hiroshi into his arms, even as a little baby. Hiroshi had never much liked being held, but he knelt down to his eye level. I refused to teach Mamoru when he was your age. Did you know that? No, Tusama. I regret that now, Takuru said evenly. He was powerful, like only a Matsuda can be, and he needed a Matsuda to train him. You're the same, aren't you? Hiroshi stared at his father for a moment and then, as if a terrible pain were bleeding out of him, breathed, Yes, Tusama. I can teach you to control this. Takuru put his fingertips to Hiroshi's chest. This cold power that seems too big for your body. I can train you to control it and use it if you are ready. Your brother, Mamoru, your uncle Takashi, and myself, we did not get proper training as small children. You are strong as we were, but I will make you stronger if you are ready to learn from me. I will make you the strongest Matsuda who ever lived. Are you ready, Matsuda Hiroshi? Yes, Tusama. Then I will see you in the dojo tomorrow morning before the sun rises. Misaki watched in astonishment as the tension melted from Hiroshi's shoulders. He still stood unnaturally straight for such a young boy, but he no longer looked like something in him might snap. Great Nagi, Misaki, Setsuko whispered in Misaki's ear, her eyes wide. What did you do to that man? It's hard to explain, Misaki said with a smile. Setsuko's eyes passed over Misaki's tangled hair, her borrowed hakama, and the black sword at her hip. If she was able to infer what had happened, she didn't pry. Instead, she lifted a hand and poked a finger into Misaki's cheek, into her dimple. Welcome back, pretty girl. The men who had responded to the explosion returned shortly after. If they had thought that Takeru's story was crazy, their doubt had disappeared as they discovered the bloody chunks of the litigii scattered across the mountainside, and they were now eager to hear the story recounted in more detail. However, before Takeru could respond to their barrage of questions, Amino Kentaro came scrambling back into the courtyard. Matsuda Dano, he said, and Misaki could see on his face that something was wrong. What is it? We're missing someone. What? Who? A child, the man said, a 5-year-old girl named Ginkua Yukimi. Yukimi was one of the children orphaned in the Ranganese attack. Her young father and younger uncles had died trying to hold the northern pass. Her mother, one of Yukino Dai's cousins, had been hit by one of the bombs during the airstrike. Have everyone search their dwelling, Takeru said. Mobilize the men to fan out and search the mountain, only the men, he added, and only fighters. Blacksmiths, monks, and women are to remain in or near their own homes until we have confirmed that our assassin has no allies lurking on this mountain. What about the girl's parents? One of the newer volunteers asked. Where are they? She has no parents, Takeru said, but she is family to all of us. Ginkua Yukimi's father died defending this village. Her mother was one of Lightning Dai's cousins, from the same branch of the Yukino family as my own mother. This child is our blood. She belongs to all of us, and it is our responsibility to find her safe. Do you think she was taken by the same person who set off the bomb? One of the Amino men asked. Or do you think he had associates who took her? I can't say. Takeru glanced for a moment toward Misaki, possibly thinking that she might have some idea, but she was as lost as he was. What if the bomber hadn't come alone? What if there were more litigiwo? She had a sudden, sickening image of a stranger putting on the face of Ginkua Yukimi's mother or father. If the tattooed man had watched and memorized Mamoru's features, he had almost certainly done the same to other residents of Takayubi. Takeru and Misaki had nearly fallen for their attacker's illusion. A traumatized 5-year-old wouldn't stand a chance. The person my wife and I encountered earlier used illusions to take the form of our son, Takeru said. My wife has experience with his type of sub-Theonite. She will explain how to see through one of these illusions. Misaki told the men to watch for flickering or ripples of light, like those on the surface of water. Be wary of anyone who doesn't speak, she added. Litigua can't imitate voices. As long as members of your search parties exchange words every time you cross paths, you should all be fine. As the men scrambled to organize a search, Takeru sent Setsuko to gather the women and children so that he could conduct a second count and Misaki could instruct all of them on seeing through a litigi's illusions. When all the men were gone, Takeru knelt outside the Matsuda compound and put his palms to the snow. What are you doing? One of the women asked. Takeru closed his eyes. I'm going to find Ginkua Yukimi. He stayed there, perfectly still, for nearly a wadi, leaving Misaki to try to explain to confused villagers and volunteers what he was doing. Some of them looked skeptical, but none of them were willing to question Takeru's abilities, however bizarre they might seem. When his eyes finally opened, he was frowning. Call the men back, he said quietly. What? Why Matsuda Dano? The intruders are no longer on the mountain, and neither is Ginkua Yukimi. What do you mean? Is she dead? Takeru shook his head. I didn't sense any bodies in the snow or in the lake, and if she was exposed up on rocks, our scouts would have found her. She is no longer on the mountain. So, someone just took her away, one of the women asked, clutching her own little girl closer to her chest. Why would anyone do that? Theories raced like flurries through the village through the rest of the evening. In the past week, the people of Takayubi had begun consolidating their food supplies in the wrecked remains of what had once been the Matsuda sitting room. Come spring, the half-room would not be structurally sound enough for occupation, but for the moment, Takaru's ice reinforcements made it a decent cafeteria, with the icier half serving as a refrigeration unit while the wooden half, open to the rest of the village, became a cooking area. Every night, Misaki would gather a handful of women and they would cook together in a few large pots. With no electricity to run a grill or the single remaining rice cooker, it was more efficient to prepare the food for the whole village at once. Tonight, an unprecedented number of women showed up to help with dinner, nearly half the women in Takayubi. Some came to talk. Some came for companionship. All made their hands busy helping. Do you think this is the government's way of trying to intimidate us? Mayumi asked, passing Misaki the ladle she had asked for. First, it's dangerous to say things like that, Misaki said. You want to be careful about who hears you. And second, I really doubt it. But Matsuda Dano, you were the one who suggested that the emperor might send assassins. I know, Misaki said, but there are certain tactics a tyrannical government uses to intimidate its subjects. For one thing, they like to make themselves known for what they are: soldiers in uniform, not foreigners in weird costumes. I also think that if this was an attempt at intimidation, the kidnappers would have taken a child with living parents. That was what the Yamankulu used to do to the native Baxarians to keep them in line, but Misaki decided that she had spoken enough treason against the empire without dragging their closest allies through the mud as well. She shook her head. If they wanted to maximize the psychological impact, they wouldn't have chosen an orphan. But she wasn't just any orphan, Fuyuhi protested, looking wounded. She was a child of Takayubi, our blood. It's as your husband said, she belonged to all of us. But the government wouldn't understand that, Misaki said. She paused, midway through stirring the soup, a handful of spices poised above the bubbles. With the heat from the boiling water rushing over her skin, she remembered something Robin had said to her a long time ago, on that rooftop, when she had questioned whether the North Enders of Livingston were worth saving. Everyone in this part of town has been oppressed or abandoned by Theonite powers the rest of the world depends on. But they don't give up. Instead, they've made a life and a culture here for themselves. It's not perfect, but it's worth protecting, even if the ruling Theonites and the politicians and the police have all decided otherwise. She had never expected to understand that part of Robin, never thought those words would make so much sense to her. Matsuda Dano, Fuyuhi said. Are you all right? Fine. Misaki opened her hand, dropping the spices into the soup. Just remembering something. She shook her head. It doesn't matter. The point is, you saw what Colonel Song and his men were like. The way our village works, the way we care for each other, is something they wouldn't understand. This just doesn't have the hallmarks of a government trying to scare its people into obedience. Then do you think it's the Ranganese? Fuyuko asked. I don't know, Misaki said, and I really don't know why you ladies expect me to have all these answers. You know I'm a housewife, not a spy, right? Fuyuko shrugged. You talk like one sometimes. And a lot of the time, you're right, Hayuri said. Misaki shook her head. My husband and the other men will keep doing everything in their power to find out. In the meantime, all we can do is keep each other safe. Yukimi's disappearance had the effect of making the village pull closer together. In another town, a missing orphan might have gone unnoticed, but this was Takayubi, and the loss reverberated through every parent and every home. Kotetsu Katashi and his children fashioned a set of standing torches, which the corona then placed throughout the village to keep the space illuminated through the night, hopefully discouraging intruders. Mizumaki Fuyuko and 2 volunteers moved into the orphanage to make sure there were extra eyes on the children. A pair of Amino men climbed to the Kimona temple to guard the monks who had taken up residence there. And sleep schedules were rearranged to ensure that at least 3 people were on watch at different stations throughout the village at all times. Except for the few men Takaru sent to inquire after Yukimi in the nearest fishing towns, everyone, residents and volunteers alike, stayed in or near the village. Misaki had not known Ginkuwa Yukimi or her parents, but she still felt an ache for the little girl as she put her own children to bed. Everyone in the village felt it, like the failure belonged to all of them. When Misaki slid open the door to the bedroom, she found Takaru kneeling on the tatami, his back to her. "Sorry," she whispered, recognizing the stillness of meditation. "I didn't mean to disturb you." "It's all right," he said. "She's gone." He shook his head and turned to Misaki, his face looking hollow and tired in the lantern light. "There's no point. You've kept trying to find her this whole time? I promised you that I would keep all of us safe." "You did everything you could," Misaki said softly. "No one could have predicted this." Kneeling before the wooden plank that now served as her dressing table, Misaki pulled the pins from her hair and let it down over her shoulders. "So, you haven't had any ideas about what might have happened?" Takaru asked as she ran her fingers back through her hair, easing the tension from her scalp. She shook her head. "I'm sorry, Takaru-sama. Who is Kaliso?" That question made Misaki pause, her fingers still in her hair. "Sorry. You asked the litigii about someone called Kaliso," Takaru said. "The name sounds familiar. You probably heard it on the TV at some point. He's a Livingston crime lord. He was well known in Kerry when I was a teenager. His followers wore gray robes, but they never had facial tattoos or voice-activated bombs. But you thought to ask about him almost immediately," Takaru said. "What business would a local crime lord from the other side of the world have with Takayubi?" "Well, it's possible that it's not Takayubi he has business with." Misaki's fingers slid to the end of her hair to fiddle with a knot there. "It's me." "Why?" Takaru asked. "What is your relationship to this crime lord?" Gathering a breath, Misaki turned from her makeshift dressing table to face her husband. "I spent my final year at Daybreak Academy fighting him." "What?" "Well, not directly fighting," she amended, fingers working at the knot in her hair. "I think we only had the one physical confrontation. Mostly my school friends and I fought his followers and tried to prevent him from overrunning Livingston's other gangs." Takaru blinked at her with the blank look of a man absolutely oversaturated with new experiences for the day. He had been assaulted by his own subconscious, his wife, an illusionist, and a bomb all within the past 20 watanu. That was to say nothing of all the talking he had done, which had to be taxing for a person who was most comfortable in the silence of his study or dojo. He was probably at the end of strange things he could absorb. "It's probably not important," Misaki sighed. "Kaliso was the first suspect who came to mind when I saw the gray cloak, but the rest doesn't add up. Sekhmet Kaliso shouldn't even know my real identity. The only time we fought, we were both masked." "You fought this person?" "Not very successfully. He threw me off a building." "You were a crime fighter," Takaru said. "Assistant crime fighter," Misaki said. "My friends did most of the work." "Your friends?" "Yes. You've met one of them actually." Misaki looked into her lap, not meeting Takaru's eyes. "The boy who came here for you," Takaru said. "Robin Thundiel." Misaki winced. "Yes." Her shoulders tensed, but Takaru didn't comment further on Robin. "I thought you had just trained in the sword with your father," he said instead. "I didn't realize your practical experience went so far." "Of course, you didn't," Misaki said, too tired to hide her annoyance, but also too tired to muster genuine anger. "You told me never to speak about my time at Daybreak Academy." "Ah, yes. I think, given the circumstances, we might revisit that order." "Why did you do that?" she asked before she could stop herself. She wasn't sure if she was pushing her luck. She was unfamiliar with this new Takaru and how far his patience with her would extend, but it hurt and she had to ask. "Why wouldn't you let me talk about my past?" "I don't know," he murmured, stern eyes studying her in the lantern light. "Perhaps I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "I don't know. My mother, whenever she talked about her life before us, it would make her sad or angry." Misaki didn't think she had ever heard Takaru speak about his mother. He looked troubled. "Are you all right, Takaru-sama?" "Just tired." "You should get to sleep then," she said. "Remember, you promised to train Hiroshi before dawn." "Oh." A vaguely miserable expression crossed Takaru's face. "That's right." He paused for a moment, frowning at the opposite wall. "He really killed a man with your sword?" "Yes." Misaki looked at the floor. "I wish he hadn't. Things had gotten out of hand." "I'm sorry, you're not the one who should be sorry." I should have been there to protect all of you. And even without me there, you had no reason to think a 5-year-old would leave the safety of his hiding place to join the killing. No normal 5-year-old would attempt that, let alone succeed. It's not your fault that boy turned out too much like me. Like you. Not completely human. I think it can be dangerous, mixing powerful bloodlines the way we do in this family. Breed too strong and offspring start to become less like humans, more like gods. Isn't that the point? Misaki asked. To bring out that precious god's blood, make the strongest offspring we can? Yes, but that doesn't change the fact that it's dangerous, for the children and their mothers. I'm only thankful that Hiroshi didn't kill you. What? Not with the sword, Takaru clarified. Before that. Takaru-sama, what are you talking about? He stared off somewhere she couldn't see, the ripples of lantern light accentuating the circles under his eyes. You know, even a strong woman doesn't fare well trying to birth a god. I'm not following, Takaru-sama. My mother, Yukino Tatsuki, was an uncannily powerful Jajaka. Of course, as a woman, she did not have much occasion to use her Jia on a large scale, but I do remember that she could clear the courtyard of snow with barely the wave of her hand. The women talked about a time a small child fell in the river and was pulled under by the current. Before the boy's mother could dive in after him, my own mother lifted the river, placing him back on the bank. Great Nami, Takaru-sama, Misaki said jokingly. You're making me feel very inadequate. No. Takara shook his head. It can be a mistake, I think, to marry Matsudas and Yukinos. Creatures of such great power, the same sort of power, can have disastrous results. But your father wasn't. Misaki stopped herself before the disrespectful comment could pass her lips. This new practice of conversing honestly with her husband might have confused her sense of propriety, but she had to remember that this was Takaru she was talking to. She couldn't speak ill of Matsuda Susumu. My father was not a master of the whispering blade, Takaru conceded, clearly knowing what she had meant to say, but he didn't seem angry, nor did he ever achieve greatness as a Jajaka, but he still carried the blood of the Matsuda line. Paired with my mother's power, that produced offspring so unnaturally powerful that even she struggled to carry us. Takaru looked down, a shadow of guilt touching his features. It almost seems that human limitation resists our existence, that maybe. The gods are the sort of parents who do not wish their descendants to exceed them. Misaki studied her husband for a moment. She had traced the lines of his perfect face so many times, wondering if there was really human flesh and blood to him, when he seemed like a creature sculpted by the gods from pure winter. She had never thought to wonder how strange it would feel to be that creature, to know what a bizarre creation you were. I'm told that Takashi and Ai-sama's birth left my mother weakened and sick. My birth nearly killed her, leaving her bedridden for a year. She miscarried late in her 3rd pregnancy, while I was still very young. She might have been all right after that, but my father insisted they try again. She died a few months into that 4th pregnancy. I'm sorry, Takaru-sama. I didn't know any of that. All anyone had told Misaki of her mother-in-law was that she had died of a persistent illness. She hadn't realized that miscarriages and death were commonplace in the Matsuda household. She wondered if her father had known. If he had known, would he have married her to this house? She shoved those thoughts away. It didn't matter. It was all done now. It had been done many years ago. And Misaki was still alive in this moment with her husband. That was all that mattered. We didn't talk about it, Takaru said. If Takashi or I mentioned it, if we talked about our mother, Tusama would beat us. This too was a new thought to Misaki. For years, she had viewed Matsuda Susumu as her tyrant. She never really considered what Takaru and Takashi would have suffered as his sons. And she had never thought to be thankful that neither of the brothers had carried on their father's violent tendencies. The instances in which Takaru had raised a hand to Mamoru were few. Perhaps there had just been the once, that strange day Mamoru had called into question his empire and everything he lived by. Of course, there was the dojo, where Takaru would hit Mamoru's side or his knuckles in training, when he left an opening, when there was a lesson to be learned. But Takashi and Takaru had learned their superior swordplay from their grandfather, Matsuda Mizudori. Susumu had never had any lessons for them. Only resentment. I think, Takeru said very slowly, he was not a good father. He was certainly not a good husband. Misaki looked at Takeru in complete shock. What is it? He asked, seeing her eyes go wide. I don't think I've ever heard you criticize your father. She hadn't intended the look of shame that crossed his face. I shouldn't disrespect him. I know. But, he hurt my mother. That was no surprise to Misaki, especially if Takeru's mother had been as powerful as he described. If there was one thing Susumu had hated over anything else, it was being reminded of his own inadequacy. She hit him as well, Takeru continued slowly, as if reaching far back into his memory for things he had probably never articulated, things he had probably tried to forget. They were always fighting. With other people, my mother was all right. She was a kind person, but she and my father could never agree on anything, and they made each other miserable. If he spoke to her, he was yelling. If she spoke to him, she was crying. Takashi and Ai-sama told me much later that she had a wonderful smile. He shook his head. I have no memory of her smiling. I'm sorry, Misaki said quietly. I didn't know. But why was he telling her this now? He seemed so tired. Surely, he had dredged up enough pain for one day. It was obvious when you married me that you didn't want to be here, Takeru said, so I tried to keep a respectful distance from you. I was certain that if you spoke about your life before coming here and all you left behind, that we would fight. He was right. If Misaki had let herself dwell on Livingston and Robin, let herself speak about it, she would have fought him. But would that really have been such a bad thing? Would it have been worse than 15 years of utter loneliness? I didn't want things between us to be like they were between my parents, Takeru said. I didn't want our sons to grow up as I did, not quite human. As Misaki looked at her husband in the lantern light, everything started to make sense. Takeru had never witnessed a marriage without violence. He had been trying to keep them from that the only way he knew how. With silence. In a twisted way, it all made sense. When you first miscarried, I was worried that you were heading toward the same fate as my mother. I thought that I was killing you. But you didn't, Misaki said, at once touched and confused by the idea that Takeru would blame himself for the weakness of her body. That was my failure, not yours. Not a failure, Takeru said. You're still alive. Misaki blinked. I lost your children. As I explained, that is common among Matsuda wives. It is less common for a woman to miscarry even once and survive. You must have been protected by the gods, or perhaps by the blood magic that gives your family such strength. Perhaps your subconscious blood manipulation purged your dangerous offspring before the pregnancy could kill you both. You think I killed your children, Misaki said, like your father always said. I think you saved my wife, Takeru said. Your Susanoo blood helped you survive where my mother could not. In that way, I suppose, our fathers made us a good match. Misaki breathed out with a twisted smile. That's a bit morbid, Takeru-sama. Takeru didn't return the smile. He was still wearing the pained, repentant expression that was so new to Misaki, so hard to look at, even if it was long overdue. I knew you were in pain after losing those children, he said, the way my mother was in pain before she died. But I admit, to my shame, that I didn't know what to do. I still don't. You're speaking to me, Misaki said. All I wanted then was for you to speak to me, so I wouldn't be alone. Takeru shook his head. I thought that if I tried to put myself close to you, you would push me away. I thought that if I spoke to you, it would turn into a fight. But there are worse things than fighting, Misaki said. I like a bit of fighting. It's silence I can't stand. Then I am the worst husband in Kaigen. No. Misaki said softly, I could have broken the silence too. She just hadn't had the courage. So much of her anger had spawned from Takeru treating her like a doll, but she hadn't been much better. She had treated him like a human-shaped mass of ice, without considering that there might be entirely human reasons that ice had formed. I'm sorry I left you in silence all this time, Takeru said. I don't know if I understand it, but I am glad we fought today. Misaki nodded. Me too. Men like Matsuda Takeru the First existed only in legends, because of course, there were no real men who could end the troubles of a kingdom with a stroke of the sword. Misaki and Takeru's fight hadn't magically imbued them with love and understanding. It didn't heal the pain of Mamoru's absence. But it was something like the beginnings of a scab. It was the first sign that things could get better. When Misaki and Takeru lay down on their futon together, a wave of their cold extinguished the flame in the lantern, leaving only the gray-blue mix of moonlight and shadows. The darkness didn't threaten nightmares now that Misaki was no longer alone in it. It seemed like the most natural thing in the world when Takeru moved to touch her, then he paused. "What is it?" she whispered. "You hate it when I touch you," he said, not an accusation but a simple fact. "You've always hated it." Misaki didn't try to deny it. She didn't know if she could make herself like his touch, but she leaned in and brushed her cheek against his fingers. Then she reached out and held him. Cold. But what did that matter? So was she. Nestling closer, she rested her head on his shoulder. He would never have that hot spark that set her desire to a boil, but when she closed her eyes, no nightmares came. In her husband's embrace, wrapped in the sound of his steady breathing, she slept soundly for the first time in a month.